the unlikely diplomat, the assignment nobody wanted. Marcus Webb stared at his reflection in the transport ship's polished viewport and wondered how his life had gone so spectacularly off course. 3 weeks ago, he had been contentedly processing trade agreements in the outer colonies. Now he was hurtling through space toward the most important diplomatic mission in human history, armed with nothing but a rushed briefing and the desperate hope that someone had made a terrible mistake. The war between humanity and the Zephyrian Empire had raged for 7 years. 7 years of skirmishes along disputed borders, of cargo vessels disappearing into the black, of colonies going dark and never answering hails again. Neither side had the resources for total war, but both had enough pride to keep bleeding each other slowly across the void. Ambassador Chen was supposed to lead these talks. Chen, with her decades of experience and her gift for reading alien psychology. But Chen had collapsed 2 days before departure, struck down by a virus that no one could identify and everyone suspected was sabotage. The diplomatic corps had scrambled to find a replacement, and somehow, impossibly, that replacement was Marcus. His assistant, a young woman named Sarah Kim, floated into the observation deck with 2 bulbs of something that claimed to be coffee. She handed one to Marcus and settled beside him, her expression mixing sympathy with barely concealed panic. "You've been staring at that briefing packet for 6 hours," she said gently. "You know you've memorized it by now." Marcus took a sip of the coffee and immediately regretted it. Did you know the Zephyrians have 17 different words for betrayal? 17. Each one with subtle variations that can completely change the meaning of a diplomatic overture. "I did know that," Sarah replied. "I also know you speak 4 languages fluently and once talked a Centauri warlord out of starting a trade war over spoiled fruit. That was different. The Centauri actually wanted peace. They just needed to save face." Marcus gestured at the vast emptiness beyond the viewport. "The Zephyrians? I'm not sure they want this at all." The Zephyrian Empire was an enigma wrapped in contradictions. Their culture valued honor above all else, yet they were master strategists who saw deception as an art form. They were fiercely protective of their territory, yet they had originally made contact with humanity, seeking trade partnerships. And then something had gone wrong. The historical records were murky, conflicting. Both sides blamed the other for the first shots fired. What Marcus knew for certain was that the Zephyrians were beautiful, terrifying, and completely alien in ways that made his anthropocentric training feel inadequate. Tall and graceful, with skin that shimmered like oil on water, shifting through colors that reflected their emotional states. Their eyes were large and multifaceted, seeing in spectrums humans couldn't imagine. And they communicated as much through subtle changes in their bioluminescent patterns as through spoken language. "We'll be arriving at the neutral station in 4 hours, Sarah informed him, pulling up a holographic display. The Zephyrian delegation arrived yesterday. 37 members, including Empress Kalindra herself. Marcus felt his stomach drop. "The Empress is coming personally?" Apparently she insisted. Sarah's fingers danced through the display, pulling up what little information they had on the Zephyrian ruler. Kalindra the Unyielding they call her. She took the throne 9 years ago after her predecessor died in what may or may not have been an assassination. She's consolidated power, crushed 2 internal rebellions, and personally led forces in at least 4 major engagements against us. The hologram showed a figure of ethereal beauty and obvious danger. Kalindra stood nearly 7 feet tall, her form elegant and alien. Her skin currently displayed deep purples and silvers in the image, though Marcus knew those colors would shift with her moods. She wore elaborate armor that looked ceremonial but was reportedly fully functional, and her multifaceted eyes stared out from the hologram with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable even through a recording. "She lost someone close to her early in the war," Sarah continued quietly. "Her bonded partner, Thalen. He was killed in one of the first major battles. Some analysts think that's why she's been so ruthless." Marcus studied the image, trying to imagine sitting across from this being and convincing her that peace was possible. "What else do we know about her?" "Not much. The Zephyrians guard their personal information closely. We know she's considered brilliant, both as a strategist and a scholar. Before the war she was apparently quite different. More open to human contact." Sarah hesitated. "There's one odd thing in the intelligence reports. About 4 years ago, there was a noticeable shift in her tactics. She became less aggressive, more willing to accept stalemates rather than push for total victory. No one knows why." The transport ship shuddered slightly as it began its final approach to the neutral station. Marcus could see it now through the viewport, a massive construct of silver and crystal, built specifically for these negotiations. It hung in space between human and Zephyrian territory, claimed by neither side, a fragile bubble of neutrality in a hostile cosmos. First contact. The docking procedure took 20 minutes of careful maneuvering. By the time Marcus and Sarah emerged into the station proper, his nerves had wound themselves into knots that no amount of diplomatic training could untangle. The neutral station was impressive in its stark functionality. Smooth walls and pale gray, lighting that adjusted automatically to be comfortable for both human and Zephyrian eyes, gravity set at a compromise point between their preferences. Everything designed to give neither side an advantage, to strip away every possible excuse for conflict. A human security detail waited at the docking port, led by Commander Torres, a woman whose expression suggested she'd seen too much combat to have much faith in peace talks. "Ambassador Webb," she greeted him with a nod. "The conference chamber is prepared. The Zephyrian delegation is already assembled and waiting." "Of course they are," Marcus muttered. Arriving first was a power move, a way to claim psychological ownership of the space. He straightened his formal diplomatic jacket and nodded. "Let's not keep them waiting any longer." The walk to the conference chamber felt like a march to an execution. Their footsteps echoed in the empty corridors. Through windows, Marcus could see stars wheeling slowly as the station rotated. Somewhere out there, fleets from both sides waited, ready to resume hostilities if these talks failed. The conference chamber doors were massive things, ornately decorated with symbols from both human and Zephyrian cultures, intertwined in patterns that were probably meant to suggest harmony but mostly just looked confused. Commander Torres placed her hand on the access panel, and the doors began to slide open. Marcus took a breath, gathered every scrap of diplomatic training he possessed and stepped through. The chamber was circular, dominated by a large oval table with seats arranged to ensure no one sat at a head position. The Zephyrian delegation occupied one side, a rainbow of shifting colors and watchful multifaceted eyes. They wore formal robes that Marcus recognized from his briefing materials as ceremonial negotiation attire. And at the center of their formation sat Empress Calindra. In person she was even more striking than the hologram had suggested. Her skin currently shimmered with deep blues and greens, colors that Marcus's crash course in Zephyrian emotional displays suggested indicated cautious formality. Her armor was silver and elegant, adorned with markings that probably denoted rank and achievement. She sat with perfect posture, her large eyes tracking Marcus's every movement. Marcus moved to his designated seat, Sarah settling beside him while the security detail took positions along the walls. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with years of conflict and suspicion. Following protocol, Marcus was the first to speak. He stood, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening, and began the carefully prepared opening statement. "Empress Calindra, honored delegates of the Zephyrian Empire," his voice carried clearly in the chamber, "I am Marcus Webb, representing the United Human Colonies in these negotiations. We gather here today because both our peoples have suffered enough. 7 years of conflict have cost us resources, territory, and lives we can never recover. But it is not too late to choose a different path." He paused, watching for reactions. The Zephyrian delegates remained still, their colors shifting slightly in patterns he couldn't quite interpret. But Calindra? Something was wrong. The Empress's colors had changed dramatically, flooding with bright yellows and silvers that pulsed across her skin like electricity. Her multifaceted eyes had gone wide, and she had gone completely still, her body rigid in her chair. Marcus faltered mid-sentence. Around the table, the Zephyrian delegates were leaning toward their Empress, their own colors shifting to concerned oranges and reds. One of them, an older Zephyrian with battle scars marking his arms, spoke rapidly in their language, but Calindra didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at Marcus like she'd seen something impossible. Sarah touched his arm, her whisper barely audible. "Marcus, what's happening?" "I don't know," he replied, abandoning his prepared speech. "Your Majesty, if I've given offense." "Your voice." Calindra's words cut through the chamber like a blade. She spoke in perfect, unaccented English, her tone mixing shock with something that sounded almost like fear. "I know your voice." The statement hung in the air, absurd and impossible. Marcus had never met this being before in his life. He'd never even been in the same sector of space as the Zephyrian Empire until this mission. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "I believe there's been some confusion. This is my first." "No." Calindra stood abruptly, her colors now cycling rapidly through yellows, whites, and silvers. The Zephyrian delegates around her rose as well, their postures defensive. "I know your voice. I have heard you speak before." Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. A recorded message? Some previous diplomatic broadcast? But he'd never done any work involving the Zephyrians before this week. The scarred Zephyrian delegate spoke urgently to Kalindra in their own language. Marcus's translator implant picked up fragments. Protocol, compromise, cannot trust. But Kalindra raised one elegant hand, silencing her advisor. Her eyes never left Marcus, and there was something in her gaze now beyond shock. Recognition. Certainty. And underneath it all, an emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. 4 years ago, she said slowly, her colors still shifting unstably, in the darkest moment of my life, someone spoke to me. Someone who should not have been able to reach me, who found a way through every security protocol we had. Someone who talked to me through the night and gave me a reason to. She stopped, seeming to struggle with the memory. I would know that voice anywhere. And then, like a dam breaking, Marcus remembered. 4 years ago. A late-night monitoring shift at a remote communications outpost. An encrypted Zephyrian transmission he'd accidentally intercepted. And a decision that had violated every protocol he'd been taught. A decision he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it had never happened. His face must have shown something, because Kalindra's colors suddenly stabilized into a pattern of deep purples and golds. It was you, she whispered. The conference chamber erupted into chaos. The voice from the void. The breaking of protocol. The Zephyrian delegation surged to their feet, colors flashing warning reds and aggressive oranges. The human security detail moved forward, hands going to weapons they weren't supposed to have in this neutral space. Sarah was pulling at Marcus's arm, trying to get him to sit down, to say something, to fix whatever had just broken. But Marcus couldn't move. He was frozen in the memory of that night, a moment he'd locked away and never examined too closely because the implications were too dangerous, the consequences too severe. Empress, the scarred advisor was saying urgently, this could be some kind of trick, a psychological manipulation. Vector, be silent. Kalindra's voice carried absolute authority, and the chamber fell quiet. Her colors had settled into a pattern Marcus didn't recognize, complex and shifting. Clear the room. Your Majesty, that violates, another Zephyrian delegate began. I said clear the room. Kalindra's colors flashed bright red for just an instant, and every Zephyrian in the chamber flinched. All of you. Now. Commander Torres stepped forward. Ambassador Webb, I can't allow. Commander, Marcus found his voice, though it sounded distant to his own ears. Please wait outside. Sir, protocol clearly states. I know what protocol states. Marcus looked at Torres, seeing her genuine concern. But I think the Empress and I need to have a conversation that's about 4 years overdue. Torres's jaw worked like she was chewing on arguments, but after a long moment she nodded curtly. 5 minutes. Then I'm coming back in whether you like it or not. The delegations filed out slowly, reluctantly. The Zephyrians kept glancing back at their Empress, clearly worried. Sarah was the last human to leave, pausing at the door to give Marcus a look that promised a very long conversation later. Then the massive doors sealed shut with a sound of finality, and Marcus was alone with Empress Kalindra, the unyielding ruler of the Zephyrian Empire, and the being whose life he might have saved 4 years ago without even knowing who she was. The silence stretched between them. Kalindra moved first, walking slowly around the oval table until she stood just a few meters from Marcus. Up close, he could see the intricate patterns in her skin, the way her colors shifted like auroras beneath her surface. Her eyes, multifaceted and alien, studied him with an intensity that made him feel transparent. Tell me, she said quietly, how a human communications technician managed to breach the most secure channel in the Zephyrian Empire. I wasn't trying to breach anything, Marcus said honestly. I was monitoring standard traffic patterns at a remote listening post. Routine work, mostly boring. But that night I picked up something different. An encrypted transmission, but the encryption was... He paused, remembering, broken. Like someone had deliberately weakened it. Kalindra's colors shifted to darker blues. I weakened it. I needed someone to hear. Anyone. I just never imagined it would be... a human. Marcus supplied. Someone who would answer. Kalindra turned away, moving to the chamber's large viewport that looked out on stars. Do you know what I was planning to do that night? Marcus had guessed, had pieced it together from the fragments of conversation he remembered. Something that would have ended the possibility of peace. I was going to authorize the release of a biological weapon. Kalindra's voice was flat, emotionless. A virus designed specifically to target human genetic markers. Would have killed millions. Maybe billions. Our scientists had been working on it for 2 years, and that night I had finally decided to use it. The casual enormity of what she was describing made Marcus's throat tight. Why didn't you? The night that changed everything. Calindra's colors shifted to soft grays and whites, colors Marcus had learned meant remembrance, nostalgia. Because a stranger with a kind voice asked me if I was all right. I remember thinking the transmission sounded like a distress call, Marcus said. Not the standard military kind, but personal. Like someone calling out into the void just to see if anyone would answer. That's exactly what it was. Calindra's reflection in the viewport seemed to shimmer. Thalen had been dead for 3 years by that point. 3 years of rage and grief and the crushing weight of leadership during wartime. My advisors were telling me that the biological weapon was our best chance for victory. The tactical projections supported its use. And I was so tired of losing people, of making decisions that sent soldiers to their deaths. She turned back to face Marcus, and her colors were shot through with threads of gold that might have been sadness or might have been something else. I encrypted the transmission to my own flagship, deliberately weakened the security, and sent it out hoping some young communications officer on my own side might pick it up and talk me out of what I was about to do. I never thought someone on the other side would intercept it. Marcus remembered the moment clearly now, pulled from the buried memory. The voice that had come through his console, speaking broken English learned from intercepted transmissions, asking in a small, exhausted voice if anyone was listening. I should have reported it immediately, he said. Logged it, sent it up the chain of command. It was potentially valuable intelligence. Why didn't you? Because you sounded like my sister. The admission came out before Marcus could stop it. She'd called me like that once years ago in the middle of the night when her husband died. Just needed someone to talk to remind her that the universe still had people in it. Calindra moved closer, her colors cycling through patterns Marcus was beginning to understand. Curiosity, wonder, and underneath it all, a vulnerability that seemed completely at odds with every intelligence report about the ruthless Empress. What did we talk about? She asked. I remember pieces, but it's like a dream. I was so tired, so lost in my own darkness. Marcus closed his eyes, letting the memory surface fully. You told me about Thalen. How he used to collect rocks from every world you visited together. How he sang off-key but didn't care. How he died protecting a colony evacuation, buying time for civilians to escape. I told a human enemy all of that, Calindra said wonderingly. I violated every security protocol, every tactical principle. I shared personal details that could have been weaponized against me. You needed to remember why you were fighting, Marcus said. Not just what you were fighting against. We talked for 3 hours. You told me about Zephyrian poetry, about the philosophy of honor that guides your people. And I told you about human music, about our concept of resilience. We weren't enemies that night. We were just two people trying to make sense of loss. And at the end you asked me a question. Calindra's voice was barely above a whisper. You asked if the person I'd lost would have wanted me to become someone who could order the deaths of billions. The memory of that moment was crystal clear. The long silence after he'd asked. The sound of breathing across an encrypted channel, across light years of empty space. And finally, a quiet thank you before the transmission ended. I canceled the biological weapon program the next morning, Calindra said. Destroyed all the research, scattered the scientists to different projects. My advisors thought I'd lost my mind. Vector argued with me for hours. But you didn't tell them why. How could I? The ruler of the Zephyrian Empire, taking counsel from an anonymous human voice in the night. Calindra's laugh was bitter. I would have been removed from power. They would have said I'd been compromised, manipulated. So I buried it, classified the entire transmission under protocols so secret that even I couldn't access it without triggering alerts. I did the same thing, Marcus admitted. Erased the logs, never mentioned it in any report. My superiors would have court-martialed me for not reporting enemy contact. And honestly, I half convinced myself it had never happened. They stood in silence, the weight of shared secrets hanging between them. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled slowly, indifferent to the complexities of beings who thought themselves important. The war changed after that night, Marcus said. Historians mark it as a turning point. The Zephyrian Empire became more willing to accept negotiated settlements instead of pushing for total victory. Some analysts credit it to resource constraints, others to internal political pressure. It was because I remembered what Thalen taught me, Calindra said softly. That honor isn't about winning. It's about being able to live with yourself when the fighting is done. The choice. A chime sounded, signaling that the 5 minutes had elapsed. Through the doors, Marcus could hear Torres and the Zephyrian delegates arguing about who would enter first. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked. "Our people are outside those doors expecting us to negotiate peace. They have no idea that we've already..." "Already what?" Kalindra challenged. "Already connected? Already shared more honesty in one night than most beings share in a lifetime? Already changed the course of a war without anyone knowing? It could be seen as a conflict of interest," Marcus said. "If anyone knew, both our delegations would demand we recuse ourselves from these talks. Would they be wrong?" Kalindra's colors shifted to questioning yellows and greens. "How can I negotiate objectively with someone who once saved my life by simply listening?" Marcus considered this. Outside, the voices were getting louder, more insistent. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe objectivity is overrated. Maybe what this negotiation needs isn't two sides carefully maintaining their distance. Maybe it needs two people who've already proven they can talk to each other like they're not enemies." Kalindra's colors brightened, threads of gold weaving through blues and greens. "The delegations won't like it." "Since when do you care about that?" Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "You're Kalindra the Unyielding, aren't you? And you're the human who had the audacity to answer a distress call from the enemy's empress and treat it like it mattered." Kalindra moved toward the doors. "Very well. Let's give them something to really argue about." She activated the door controls, and both delegations spilled into the chamber, bringing their concerns and protests and security protocols with them. But before anyone could speak, Kalindra raised her hand, colors flashing to command attention. "The ambassador and I have reached an understanding," she announced. 4 years ago, in violation of protocols neither of us want to explain, we had a conversation. That conversation changed the course of this war. It is time both our peoples knew why." The chamber erupted in questions, but Kalindra spoke over them, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had made her decision and would not be swayed. "Ambassador Webb reminded me of something I had forgotten in my grief and rage. He reminded me that honor and vengeance are not the same thing. That the ones we've lost would not want us to become monsters in their names. And because of that conversation I chose differently." She turned to Marcus, colors shifting to patterns he was beginning to recognize as respect, gratitude, and perhaps something more. "So yes, I know his voice. I know it because it was the voice that pulled me back from an abyss. And if that makes me unfit to negotiate objectively, so be it. But I would argue that two parties who have already proven they can hear each other, truly hear each other, are exactly what these talks need." Marcus stepped forward, addressing both delegations. 4 years ago, I made a choice to treat an intercepted transmission not as intelligence to be exploited, but as a person in pain who needed help. It violated every protocol I'd been taught. And I'd make the same choice again. Because that night, the Empress and I proved something important. We can see each other as people, not just enemies. Sarah was staring at him with an expression mixing shock, admiration, and the clear promise of a very long debrief later. Commander Torres looked like she was mentally reviewing court-martial procedures. The Zephyrian delegates were a chaos of shifting colors, some angry reds, some confused oranges, but a few showing the golds and purples that suggested hope. Vector, the scarred advisor, was the first to speak. "You're telling us the shift in Empress Kalindra's strategy 4 years ago, the reason we're still alive to have these negotiations instead of being dead from human retaliation for a biological weapon attack, is because of an unauthorized communication with a human technician?" "Yes," Kalindra said simply. "That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard." Vector's colors cycled through several shades of incredulity. Then, slowly they shifted to amused golds. "It's also the most hopeful thing I've heard in 7 years of war." The tension in the room shifted, not breaking entirely, but bending in a new direction. One of the human delegates, an older woman named Ambassador Reeves who'd been pulled out of retirement for these talks, cleared her throat. "So what you're both saying," she spoke carefully, "is that peace between our species has already been proven possible. 4 years ago, two people from opposite sides of a war had a genuine conversation and it changed everything." "Yes," Marcus and Kalindra said simultaneously, then looked at each other with surprised recognition. "Then I suggest," Reeves continued, "that we stop treating this as a negotiation between enemies and start treating it as a continuation of that conversation. Not just between Ambassador Webb and Empress Kalindra, but between all of us." "You make it sound simple," one of the Zephyrian delegates objected. "We have years of grievances, territorial disputes, resource conflicts. None of which are unsolvable," Marcus countered, "if we approach them the way the Empress and I approached that night. With honesty, with the willingness to listen, and with the recognition that the being on the other side of the table is a person, not just an obstacle. Kalindra moved to her seat, colors settling into calm, purposeful blues and greens. Vector, pull up the territorial dispute files. Ambassador Webb, I believe you had some opening statements about resource sharing agreements. The long road forward. The negotiations that followed weren't easy. There were moments of anger, accusations from both sides, old wounds reopened in painful detail. But whenever things threatened to break down completely, Marcus and Kalindra would exchange glances, remembering that night when a desperate call into the void had been answered, and somehow that memory would anchor the talks back to possibility. 3 weeks later, the Zephyrian delegation and human representatives emerged from the neutral station with a framework for peace. Not a perfect peace, not an instant erasure of 7 years of conflict, but a real, workable path forward. The news spread across both territories with reactions ranging from celebration to skepticism. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a betrayal on both sides. But the fighting stopped, and ships began crossing between territories on peaceful missions for the first time in 7 years. On the final day at the neutral station, before both delegations departed for their respective territories, Marcus and Kalindra stood together at the viewport, watching the stars. Do you think it will hold? Kalindra asked. Her colors were soft golds and purples, peaceful. I think we proved something important, Marcus replied. That even in the darkest moments, even when every logical reason says to give up or give in to hate, connection is still possible. That's a powerful thing. You saved my life that night, Kalindra said quietly. Not physically, but in every way that matters. I was about to become someone I couldn't live with. You saved mine too, Marcus said. I was going through the motions, doing my job but not really believing it mattered. That conversation reminded me why I joined the diplomatic corps in the first place. Kalindra's hand, elegant and alien, reached out. Marcus took it, human fingers intertwining with Zephyrian ones, a symbol that would appear on news broadcasts across both territories. They're going to write about this, Kalindra observed. The Empress and the diplomat. How a random communication led to peace. Let them, Marcus said. Maybe it will remind people that sometimes the most important moments in history start with someone being willing to answer when another person calls out into the void. Years later, historians would indeed write about the negotiations that ended the human Zephyrian War. They would analyze the resource agreements, the territorial compromises, the carefully constructed diplomatic language that allowed both sides to claim victory. But the real story, the one that Marcus and Kalindra would carry with them always, was simpler and more profound. It was the story of a voice in the dark, reaching out in desperation, and another voice answering with compassion. It was the story of two beings from different worlds who proved that understanding was possible, even when everything suggested it shouldn't be. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between official duties and public appearances, they would both remember that night 4 years ago when an impossible conversation changed the galaxy, one word at a time.